Welcome to Questions We're Afraid to Ask.
Welcome. Welcome back. So, today we're going to talk about hominids again. And the question we want to ask is socially, emotionally, spiritually, how close are we to Neanderthal? Because we know we're cousins, we know we can be hybrids, we have the genetics behind it, and we know there's some structural differences. But how human are we? And how human were they?
It's a good question. I mean, we know the idea of like, you shave the Neanderthal and you put a suit on him and no one could tell the difference. Like that's been a trope for a long time, but I think it's actually more true than we think it is.
And I read about that recently. They were talking about it, and it wasn't a scientific journal, but it was a like a scientific journalist that was writing about this stuff. And they said that they're like, if we were to take one, clean him up, teach him our language, you probably couldn't tell. You know.
If they had language, we actually don't know that. They may not have had speech the same way that we think of speech. But
So
but they
I'm
did
going to challenge you on
interbreed,
that.
so I mean there's got to be
I'm
some
going to
form of
challenge you on
communication.
that. There is enough circumstantial evidence, I would argue, that Neanderthal had speech because there are certain social things that we don't know of a way for it to exist without some form of language, right? Even when we've studied like chimps and monkeys and great apes and things like that, the concept of language and spirituality and things of that nature develop around language. The fact that we know Neanderthal and Homo sapien interacted and
Right.
interbred at a significant level. In fact, one of the things that I was referencing today is a Wall Street Journal article, and it ends with the phrase that where's the quote from it? I had it here. It ends with the species lines are surprisingly blurred. Um, so if you know modern humans and Neanderthals mated, did we assimilate them? Did we conquer them? We probably will really never have the answers save for having a time machine. But the Paleolithic records suggest it was almost certainly the former, according to Dr. Rasmus Nielsen, an evolutionary biologist at the University of California, Berkeley. We integrated with Neanderthals. They went extinct by love. It wasn't war. So those are some of the
We
conclusions that
we
they've come to.
hope. We hope it
We
was
well,
love
I
and
mean, we
not
have
war.
evidence that leans that
Yeah.
way. I'm sure. Again, what makes us human? Fighting is part of it. But I would argue that for that to happen, there had to be a common language. I would also argue to have the level of spirituality that we have seen with burials with flowers and ornamentation and tools. You don't develop that without the concept of some higher being or God. We're just going to use God, some type of God. And you can't create myth, as far as we understand, for hominids without language, right?
Right.
So now we know that there can be a sense of loss with great apes, and we know it
Right.
because there was a great ape, specifically Coco, who was taught a significant amount of sign language. And there's this really amazing video you can go find online where Coco meets Robin Williams, who she watched on TV, and they really bonded together. And there's also the video of when they told Coco that he died, and Coco understood it and was sad and expressed a missing, a longing, and a sadness through the American Sign Language that she learned. Coco is one of my favorite great apes because I remember getting the book about Coco in the library in elementary school and reading
Yeah.
about it. And it's amazing that Because I know there's also chimpanzees that have been taught sign language, but it appears the gorillas that have learned sign language may have assimilated language better than the chimpanzees, at least as far as what I've read. But
Right.
we know that can happen with something that's not as close to us as Neanderthal. So I would argue that the advancements for Neanderthal and probably even hominids earlier on had some form of language.
And I think that's
Obviously,
fair.
it's not English, right? Or Spanish or French or whatever, the modern languages are, but some way to communicate.
And what's interesting is when you talk about that, we talk about, the Neanderthals and the burial practices they had. We were just looking at an article today that's from, I actually don't know how old this is. So many of these things that we come across, you look at it and you're like, oh, we figured this out 7 years ago. And
Oh, it's
I
been amazing.
didn't know. It's amazing.
The
But
stuff in the scientific journals isn't populating to the popular culture well.
yes. And so we found this article about a 240,000 year old um, skeletons that were found. There was a skull found of a Homo. I think I'm pronouncing this right, but it's Homo naledi,
Hmm.
which is another hominid species that, according to the numbers that I've found at this point, it's between 335,000 and 236,000 years ago. So this sort of falls in that same time frame. They coexisted with Homo heidelbergensis, Homo erectus, Neanderthals,
They were
Denisovans, and Homo sapiens.
and Florentia, the Homo floresiensis, even though there's no evidence that they actually crossed paths physically, um,
I have different dates on Floriensis that they
that's
weren't that
possible.
far back,
But
so I
again,
don't
a
know.
hobbit-sized, because they're about half the size of a modern human, from like the images of the skulls and stuff that we were able to find,
Yeah,
right?
but what's
Um,
interesting about it is that where they found this stuff. So they found these down in South Africa, down
mhm.
this dark tube that's only 6 inches wide, and it goes down this cave, and it's in the middle of out in the middle of this cave system, and there's nothing else there, and it's
And
just
significant professional spelunking to get there, right?
yeah,
Not an easy climb, and we're not talking about falling down a well, right? Like we've also found lots of bones in Africa where there's a hole in the ground and things fall down. This is not that kind of
yes.
hole. This is like climbing into it, almost into a caving system.
Yeah, it says you go through a 39-foot vertical fissure known as the chute.
Hmm.
And then they get down onto like a limestone shelf. And so what it looks like is bodies were brought to this place and left there, sort of like a mausoleum, I would guess. Just
A
a place
natural
where,
tomb,
yeah,
almost.
and they only found two other animal skeletons in there. One was from, I think they were apes. One was from way beforehand. They didn't specify when the other one was from, but they also noted that none of the bones had bite marks on them. They weren't, they were left, and they just sort of,
There was no
you
evidence
know,
of predation, right?
yes,
Or scavenging even of the animals.
it was two baboons, is
Yeah,
what it was. And one of them was significantly older. But there were no tools found. There were no artifacts. It was just like they brought the bodies in, they put them
and
down, and
and
they left them.
interred them,
Yeah.
right? That's an interpretation of it. Um,
But
so
it's just interesting that it's that far back. The
yes,
idea of taking a body and preserving it for some sort of reason, you would assume that some sort of religious reason, there's some sort of practice behind that. But if you really stop and think about that and say, okay, so we've got Neanderthals doing this, we've got these guys doing it, maybe they all were, and then
we have no idea how far back it is, but
but
we've
then you
got
have to,
strong evidence of the Neanderthal, like super strong evidence. Um,
but what does that tell us about us?
yeah,
If we talk about, even if we go back to younger dryads and say like maybe there was something before that, but like how far back before that? Like if we're talking about pre cataclysmic religions, where we were started with burying the dead, and they developed and developed and developed. Who knows where it started, where it ended up, what sort of, you
I
know.
have a theory
Okay.
on the early where the early god or gods may have come from. And this comes from my studies of religion and studies of faith, right? And I see it around and this is not dissimilar from what we've seen with some other hunter gatherer type
Hmm.
um, cultures, that the spirituality probably had a lot to do with the sky, the earth, the water, and the fire. I mean, these elements are fundamental across all cultures, and they're powerful. And if you don't understand what I mean, if you have never sat in the woods with no electronics and stared into a campfire, there is something very primal in that act. Sitting there and doing that, and it's powerful in a way that is hard to put into words for someone who hasn't done it. Uh, Another aspect that goes along with that, and this is something that you and I have both done, because we've both got an interest in camping and in primitive style camping and learning some of the older skills. The first time I ever caught a spark and
Mm.
blew it into flame, I have trouble putting into words how fulfilling that was and how connecting to the ancestors, for lack of a better way to put it,
Hmm.
that was. That act went far back. It was
Uh,
in your bones in a
it's
way.
it's the same as the first time you took me out hunting,
Hmm.
and you know getting a deer and processing it, and then I processed it myself that first time. I
You
took it
skinned it. We
home.
did the
I
whole
cooked
thing.
I
Yeah.
cooked it, and I ate it, and there was a moment as you're eating that where you're just like, oh, like, again, it's hard to explain, but you're just like, I did this,
It's just
and
like
it's ancient.
I have been with people who don't like fish, but when we get in these primitive camping get-togethers, this bushcraft get-togethers for whatever, which is the hobby, right? Bushcraft or woodcraft. And people catch a fish who don't like fish and they cook it over an open flame and they eat it and they're like, this is amazing. Who wouldn't touch a $200 plate of like expensive, crazy fish from a seafood restaurant, right?
Yes.
But they're eating this, like mudcat, you know,
There
and
is something to say for the deliciousness of food when you're hungry.
this
I
is true. This is
you
true.
know.
Uh, but all of this has an essence to it that drives deep,
Yes.
very deep. And it's in our DNA. I am a firm believer in the concept of genetic memory. That there is, we call it instinct in other animals, right?
Right.
How does a horse know how to get up and run when it's born within minutes? It's instinct. Where does that come from? No one teaches it to us, or
Well,
they
no
don't
one
teach.
no one teaches a baby to crawl. We
Yeah,
we help teach we teach kids how to walk just because we're trying to encourage them, but we don't really teach them how to crawl. They just sort of figure out how to move on their
but
own.
but do we? I mean, there are there's enough there's enough people in the world who don't have the little baby walkers and all that kind of
I
stuff,
just
and
sort of meant
you
holding
know
hands and
yeah, we
helping.
assist with it.
Yes.
But I have watched many a baby crawl up to something and put their hands on it and pull themselves up and
Yeah.
figure out how to take those steps.
Well, and they're
um
learning that from watching, and I
yes.
think that we've talked about this. I I was in a car accident when I was a kid. I have a visceral reaction to the sound of tires squealing. Like, it
Mhm.
just sets me on edge every time I hear it, just because that's what I heard right before my accident. Um, and my daughter has the same thing. She reacts the same way, and I sort of had this moment of like, okay, is that because my son doesn't? Is that a genetic memory that she has this reaction, or as an infant, did she somehow pick up on my reaction to that and develop the same thing?
And the flip side of that, I'm going to throw another curveball into it, and
Mm.
this also deals with how do we interact as what makes us human. Is she just more empathetic naturally than your son is?
Yes.
And so she has picked that up. And where does that come from?
Hmm.
And and again, what makes us human? Which I think is a very deep question because right now we're the last hominid that we know of. But what about the next one? What is the mutation that's going to cause that? Where's that going to come from? And will that
Hmm.
be human?
Right.
You know, that's an important question we need to ask now before we run into it, right? Um, and being Neanderthal, being a hybrid, I'm not pure Homo sapien. We talked about that last time a little bit. Um, I have greater than 2%. And I think the record is like 5% DNA. But I have somewhere between 2 and 3% of my DNA is Neanderthal.
And yours is like 94% more than the average person?
So 23andMe says I am 95. I have I have more Neanderthal DNA than 95% of everyone they've sampled up to
Yeah.
this point.
It was interesting. I was actually at Rogan's comedy show last week, and he was doing a bit talking about Neanderthal DNA. And he was talking about how much he had, and he had 58% more than everybody else. And so it was interesting to for him to see it and go 58's a lot, and then I'm like, oh, actually 95's a lot.
Yeah,
So
95. And I have 13 distinct variants associated with Neanderthal
out
traits.
of how many have they identified? It's like 40 something, or
This just says I have. It
does it
doesn't give
not
me a
say?
number
Okay.
because it talks about markers and traits, and it doesn't differentiate between
They're two. That's a whole different
what the
discussion
two
of
are.
DNA. Yeah.
But um, so some of these things that they say come from Neanderthal: dandruff, which I had, feeling hangry. They have traced the hangry feeling to Neanderthal DNA.
Well, then Leslie's got some Neanderthal
The
in her.
hitchhiker thumb, where your thumb curves back further and doesn't just go straight up. See, you
Yep,
have
I
Neanderthal
have it
DNA
too.
just because you have that, even though you haven't done the test, right? Sprinting versus distance.
Hmm.
I was much better a sprinter than I was a distance runner. I know that playing soccer. I played soccer for years.
So what does that tell us about Usain Bolt? That man is a Neanderthal.
Quite possibly. Um, a preference for sweet versus salty,
Hmm.
um, and I much prefer the salty over the sweet, which is a Neanderthal thing. Um, fear of heights, which I have. I've. It's weird. I wasn't afraid of heights when I was young, but I have kind of developed almost a vertigo as I've gotten older. Whereas
Hmm.
if I get really high, it's like this. The horizon almost moves. So it's not like a phobia of heights, but just like this dislike, strong dislike for it. Um,
And so the thought there is that so all of these things have come, all these traits that we've picked up are come from that interbreed. But that time frame is 300,000 years, something
at
around
least,
there.
at least, because we've talked about this, we
Yes.
think the timing goes back because remember, we're basing this off of fossils, and only like 1% of everything that dies becomes a fossil. So we have no idea how many Neanderthal there were. They're population estimates, but those are guesses, really.
So
Um,
the last thing I saw was a tooth morphology article that I only think I half understood,
mhm.
but the premise that they were making, and because I understood the abstract, was that they looked at the tooth morphology, so essentially the structure of teeth, and worked backwards from Homo sapien and Neanderthal because we actually have quite a bit of Neanderthal,
Oh,
evidence
in the last 100 years, we've found
in
so much. We really
in
have.
comparison to like the Denisovans or the Hominidalians. So, like
Yes,
we got a
absolutely.
ton of that, and so they actually had enough teeth that they could do an analysis, and the estimate that they make of when we split from Neanderthal, which means that we come from a common ancestor potentially,
Which is probably why we were able to re-interbreed and
interbreed,
hybridize,
right?
right?
But the split was 800 to 900,000 years ago.
Yeah,
So let's just call it a million because it's
yeah.
more fun
Let's
that
just
way.
round up.
So so that means that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, which up to 30,000 years ago, because I do agree. I think we probably interbred and they just sort of went away, or something else happened.
And I'm going to throw out a sidebar on this. There is some evidence that Neanderthal may still exist in some parts of like unexplored Siberia. There are and we could do a whole show on that. Just the stories of not Bigfoot, but of these strong, super short, brutish humans out of the Siberian steppes and the deep Siberia, because we forget how big Siberia is,
Yeah.
and it's also where we know Neanderthal lived, a very cold, icy type environment that was Europe but is now Siberia, and we know Neanderthal moved through Asia. It spread much further than we thought. There's even evidence that Neanderthal may have moved into the Americas at some point over a land bridge. Um,
We do know that
so
that Neanderthals were distilling tar in
yes,
Europe 200,000 years ago.
yes, which is massively advanced
Yes.
because the ability to permanently seal things together is huge. Honestly, once you have tar, you can make good ships,
Yeah.
much more seaworthy ships.
Well, and there is the genetic evidence that links the Amazon, the natives of the Amazon to the natives of Australia.
Absolutely.
Like so, and of course there were no boats that
No,
couldn't
no,
have, but
never,
like
no, no.
something happened.
And
Some
somehow those little hobbits ended up on an island that's never been connected to another piece of land with
right.
no
Where did
boats.
they come from? Yeah.
Magic.
Well, yeah, magic, absolutely. It's just you can take this back, because again, we just said let's just loosely set Homo sapiens at a million years old. Well, we found 600 obsidian hand axes from 1.2 million years ago. So
Yes.
either we go back 1.2 million, and if we're making hand axes, then we didn't start 1.2 million. It's farther back than that. Or there was something else before us. Could have been, you know, um,
Well, on
there's,
that,
a Homo
we
erectus
know
was
we
farther
know
back.
Homo erectus used hand axes. One of the first I'm going to say it, one of the first man-made tools, right? Because we're talking about what makes us human, right? And there's a lot of evidence that Homo erectus was pushing us in that direction toward what we would call culturally human. They had family groups, they probably had some kind of language, they had to teach. And so that's where I'm putting that language on, right?
Yeah.
I have I'm not good at it, but I have flint knapped. I have made stone knives. I've made a couple of stone arrowheads. My oldest son is much better at it than I am, and he has made some pretty good stone tools. And he took it a step further and has attached them to um, like antler shafts and things like that. But you have to be able to explain. You can't just show that.
Yeah. So I did a quick search while we were looking here. The oldest tools were unearthed in Kenya around Lake Turkana, I think. They were 700,000 years older than the earliest tools they had found before, and they set the date at 3.3 million years ago.
Yeah.
We were making tools 3.3 million years ago, but civilization didn't start until 6,000 years ago.
And I want
Everything
to
before
bring
that
in
is hunter gatherer.
and I want to bring in something I think is very important. when we talk about the potential for a lost culture and civilization. Because like everybody's like, where's the technology? Well, you know what? I have walked across my parents' property and found arrowheads. Nothing else was left there except the arrowheads. I have also walked across that property and the property right behind it, and I have found tin cans and glass bottles that are fading away and breaking and deteriorating. The stone doesn't. And why is this important? Why do we care? Well, there was a find, and I don't remember the year it was, but I remember hearing about it when I was like in elementary, junior high. Otzi the Iceman. That was roughly 6,000 years ago, right? And when he was found, what amazes me is the toolkit he had with him. He had a bow and arrow, stone arrows. He had clothing which was made by different people because of the styles of stitching and stuff. The supposition is it was made by different people, so that implies trading. He had a very advanced stone knife with a very intricate, like woven sheath. He also had several small, in like a leather waist belt with a leather pouch, several small, super sharp stone flakes, which are like razor blade sharp, and a bronze axe, a bronze axe head.
That was
So
cast, correct?
it was cast. It was a cast
Yes.
bronze axe head, small bronze axe head mounted to a wooden haft, right?
And
And
so
we know this because when he died, he fell into a glacier.
the date on him is between 3350 and 3105 BC. So we're talking about 5,000 5,000 couple hundred years.
Yes. So the
Mm.
yeah. So,
And
but
he was
what does that tell us?
found in 91, just so you know.
Found in 91. Okay,
Yep.
so yeah, when I was in junior high. That tells us he had access to advanced metalworking,
Hmm.
right? Because we're not talking copper, we're talking bronze, right? But the stone tools were easier to make, stayed sharper longer, were easier to upkeep for him, and he used them. And we know he used them because they found blood from other people on his arrows. So,
Mm.
we know he was killed. We know he died in some way, shape, or form because he had arrows in the back. So there was something that happened. Um, but it also shows he reused his tools, right? Because there's a lot that goes into making those things. We also know that Neanderthal made a lot of these tools too, and they were different. They used a different type of spearhead. There's a lot of evidence that the Homo sapien spears were thrown, whereas the Neanderthal ones were push spears and much heavier with heavier heads. And you have to wonder, well, is it because they weren't smart enough to throw them? Or did it fit their body size better and their physical attributes? But we also know they intermixed. So who knows what happens? What is it that makes us human is much bigger
It
than
is.
our genetics.
I want to touch back on Otzi for a second because I pulled up the wiki page. He had 61 tattoos. 61 tattoos, 19 groups of black lines. He's got parallel lines running across his body. He's got cruciforms on his knees. I mean, he's got 61 tattoos. That's craziness. That
Yeah,
they were,
that's nuts.
and then if you go pull up the wiki page, it's worth it. There's pictures of the spears and the copper axe that he had.
I've seen
Um,
them live when I was at the Smithsonian.
oh,
They're
nice.
amazing.
Well, let's see here. They've got some genetic analysis here. Let's just see if there's anything interesting in there. Mitochondrial DNA. Let's see here. He comes out of Europe, Southern European, part of the migration of early Europeans who migrated from Anatolia into Europe.
I
Interesting.
apologize. It was a copper axe.
It
It
is a
wasn't a
copper
bronze
axe.
axe. I
Yeah.
apologize. But still, copper work.
Ooh, in 2012, scientists announced that Otzi still had intact blood cells. The
Wow.
oldest complete human blood cells ever identified because he was frozen.
Yes, he was almost flash frozen in the glacier.
and he was found by some, I think it was like some German
Hikers.
tourists who found him. Pretty crazy. But again, that's only 5,000 years ago. And
Hmm.
again, we were talking about this before. Like we have this number at 6,000, um, and of civilization, and we just need to dismiss it at this point. We have evidence of at Göbekli Tepe of at least 11,000 years old, because that's when that was buried. So the 6,000-year-old date is gone. We've got to push it back farther than that. If we go back to 11,000 years ago, then that's right smack in the middle of the Younger Dryas, which means there had to be something before that. It didn't just appear at the end of a cataclysmic event. There had to have been people, because we know humans are older than that. So the question then becomes, what was before that? You get into the ancient civilization, and I think
Hmm.
where I think people start to break down is when they hear civilization, what they think is what they're thinking
Today.
is skyscrapers in today. And I think what the argument is trying to be made is that we go back and say they're hunter gatherers, and the response is no, there was a civilization. There was
And
something more than that. And what it was,
I
maybe it
want
was
to I
just
want to add
stone
on that.
tools and houses,
And I want to add on that. You can have a vibrant mobile civilization,
Yes.
right? Nomadic. There's the word I'm looking for. You can have a vibrant nomadic
The
civilization.
Mongolians did it, the
The
Native Americans did
Bedouins are
it,
still doing it.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
the Native Americans had entire governmental structures. The Cherokee nations, and the 12 civilized tribes, and all of that. But they still moved around, right? Um, and we're finding more evidence that Neanderthal in that kind of Mediterranean area and northern African area um, came together in large groups and hunted and killed elephants, not just mammoths, but elephants, and could feed up to 350 people, which makes sense because if you have a small community, a small family community, you need genetic diversity. How do you get it? You come together for a swap meet, for
It's
lack
a
of a better way to put
feast.
it.
It's a feast. I mean, we talk about how important the feast is in so many different things. We talk about feasts in the Bible, and the feasts are a thing. We the holidays that we all have now are all the feasts that we used to have, which is when that sort of thing happened.
Again, I want to get back to what is it to be human? To break bread together, to
Yes.
come together. How do we form communities? How do we form relationships? It's around a common table, right? And that's when we come together. That's when we talk. That's when we share ideas. That's when we share thoughts. That's when we share emotions. That's when we share our passions. That's when we share all these bonding moments. And there's a more primal thing to it. I need this to survive. I need
Yes.
this food to continue to exist. I am going to choose to share this with you.
Yes. This is something that Peterson talks about a little bit in the
Jordan
new
Peterson
Exodus.
for
Jordan Peterson,
yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
in the Exodus series that he's doing, that's on Daily Wire, which is spectacular if you're interested in I don't know, 28
Biblical
hours
studies.
of biblical
Yeah.
study. It's taken me forever to get through it, but it's really good. But he talks about that idea of, and I think it's in that one. It could be in one of his other lectures I've listened to, but the idea of that sacrifice of, I'm going to give up some of what's mine to you, because I know that, with it's making the sacrifice for the future gain, which is, if I give you some food now, maybe when you get food next time, you'll share with me.
Which brings me back to spirituality, because one of the earliest forms we know of worship across cultures is the giving up of and sacrifice of foodstuffs and items, right? And we see this all through the Old Testament. In fact, there is a lot of evidence, and I don't mean to insult anyone's faith when I say this, but there is a theory in biblical study that the story of Joseph sacrificing, not Joseph, I'm getting the names wrong.
Abraham.
Abraham sacrificing his son, and then God saying no, was the moral lesson to the people who became the Jews that we were going to stop human sacrifice at this point. That before
Yeah.
that, there was a tradition of human sacrifice. And this was, I don't need that kind of sacrifice anymore.
Right.
Almost an evolving of the faith, right? Which we see over time. All religions evolve over time. And this is one of those stories that they see as pivotal and necessary to have shared with everyone of that faith background, so they knew, well, we don't have to do that anymore. We don't have to kill our
Yeah.
kids anymore, right?
Well, and you also wonder if just going out on a crazy limb here, what if some of that child sacrifice that was happening was due to the fact that just like bears eat their cubs and fish eat their like it was like I've got four mouths to feed and
Not
that's a
enough
fifth one
resources.
and I just can't do it so we're going to sacrifice the child,
The
and
weakest, youngest, oldest, take your
whatever,
pick. Yeah.
the sacrifice has to be made for the good of the group. And maybe it's at that point where they go like, okay, we're stable enough and we can support the community to the level that, all right, that doesn't need to happen anymore. We
Or
can
it could
stop
run the
doing
other
that.
direction, like it did with the Aztecs, because we don't know why the
Hmm.
Aztecs, because, you know, the good conquistadors burned all their books. Um, but, and I'm being facetious, I hate
Mm-hmm.
burning of knowledge. It's just horrible. But we know at some point they started human sacrifice. We don't know why,
Right.
but it turned into mass sacrifice of a lot of people. So,
And who knows what the goal was there. You know. It's just crazy.
yeah, and again, what makes us human? What
Hmm.
makes us us? Um, did sacrifice happen with our cousins, with our Neanderthal or Denisovan or whatever cousins? Did they do it? Did they have to make those choices? Did they struggle over it? We know they were inspired to make art.
Hmm.
Again, one of my reasons I think they have language. If they have art, they have language. I mean, I don't think you get to
What
one
if
without the
what
other.
if what if though the art was the language? What if that was the way? What if there was a communication of maybe hands? Maybe there wasn't. I'm just communication can happen without there actually being vocal cord speech. Because I really do sort of get down
Yes,
and on the tangent of magic words that we talk about, like you get into ancient myths and the ideas of magic words, and maybe there is something to the fact that we're the group that actually can speak,
and
and I don't know. I'm just
I see where you're coming from, and I understand it, but I think spoken communication and body language communication evolved together over time.
absolutely.
Um, I don't think, and I think by the time we get to Neanderthal, and again, I can't know this. I don't have a time machine,
Yeah, no, and
but I
you're
would
probably right.
I would
I'm
put
just
money down that they had some form of language, or
mhm,
that if we were to de-extinction a Neanderthal, we could teach them to speak.
yeah.
I would put
I
money
don't
on that.
I don't know what the Neanderthal vocal cord situation is, but
Not
you're
dissimilar
probably
from
right.
ours, from the and their brain structure is not dissimilar from ours, from what
It's
I've read.
bigger though, I believe.
Yeah,
Yes, they had a full modern vocal tract and were capable of fully modern speech. So I am incorrect in that case.
yeah. I mean, we don't know if they did it. We don't know if it was grunts or whatever,
Yeah. Well,
right?
it also we don't know how complex their
Yeah.
communication was.
So
It
the
could have been
results are
very
solid and
simple.
clearly show Neanderthals had the capacity to perceive and produce human speech. This is
No.
one of the very few current ongoing research lines relying on fossil evidence to study the evolution of language, a notoriously tricky subject in anthropology. Um, thank you, Google. Right. Um, and that's from a news article at some college. Uh, but you know,
It's a
I don't know. I
wild
just
idea to really stop and think. I mean, because when you start asking the idea of how different are we from Neanderthal, you really start getting into the idea of like, okay, so if we're conscious, were they conscious? Probably. They're making art. They're doing burials. There's there's to the level of consciousness that anyone can consider. But then you have to start saying like, okay, well, when did that actually start? Where is consciousness?
and how far
And
back
how
do we
does
go?
yeah. Well, and then you
Because
have to start asking the question of like, well, I'm conscious. Is the dog conscious? Like they understand what I want them to do. Does that and
and
it starts to
you
get
know
weird.
we get into some of the what I call higher mammals,
Mhm.
dolphins, whales, great apes. You know, especially for me.
Mhm.
And here's where it is. Here's really where this comes from. You know, the moral quandary from two things. One, what do we do? Because I don't think it's going to come from the chimpanzee. I just, even though they're so genetically close to us, I don't think it's going to come from the chimpanzee.
It's the orangutan.
And I don't see it might come from the
No?
orangutan, but I see the gorilla, the mountain gorilla, which has
Mm.
been one of the most successful at learning language. Again, back to Coco, and expressing
Oh.
emotion to us. What do we do when they come out and start doing math? What do we do when they say, because Coco painted? Coco painted.
Did
I
they
think
try to
Coco
teach
could
Coco
add.
math? I was going to say did they
Did
I know that they've seen orangutans have been watching people spearfish and are copying them now.
yes. And so this is from Real Clear Science. Um, Coco the gorilla knows sign language, and Alex the parrot was probably the most well-known spoken bird to exist. Also, a chimpanzee was trained to use Arabic symbols to add sums as large as four, and monkeys have been taught to add dots together. So we know monkeys can learn math. We know dolphins can learn math. That's been proven. In fact, a lot of research scientists have figured out that the dolphins were messing with the research scientists because they thought it was funny.
I hadn't
They
heard
were,
that one.
oh yeah, they found that they've been throwing experiments, they've been doing stuff, they've been playing jokes, and dolphins are also the only other species that we know of today that has sex for fun and gets high. They
Yeah.
find and lick pufferfish to get high. So they're just people without arms and legs.
Yeah. Well, and then I mean I won't go down the list, but you get into octopus. They're really weird and smart and interesting.
And I've seen some evidence to
Crows.
think that octopus may not even be native to the planet. You
Yeah, I've
know,
seen
I mean
that
that's
too.
a
I
very
haven't
fringe
gone down
idea,
that yeah, I haven't
but
gone down that rabbit hole, but there is the
they're
idea that
so
the
different from everything else that maybe
yeah.
the octopus is an alien,
If
right?
the octopus is an alien, so is the mushroom. I'm just gonna
Yeah,
lay that down.
I think the mushroom may
But
be key to consciousness.
yes, see, and that's getting into the Rupert Sheldrake's stoned ape theory, which is a
Hmm.
wild idea that an early ape ate a mushroom, tripped some balls, and then was like,
Connected to
what if
the
I?
Akashic record and tapped into all knowledge and began to advance. At some point, let me just put it this way: biologists and anthropologists say at some point we ate something that began to change our brain,
Yeah.
be it cooked protein, be it something triggered it.
So there was an interesting book that Jordan Peterson talks about in his Genesis series called Catching Fire, not the Hunger Games book, but a different book called Catching Fire that really gets into the idea of early brain formation. The largest requirement for that was cooked meat. The reason being is that or it was cooked food, sorry,
Hmm.
because once you cook it, it becomes more bioavailable to your body when you eat it. It takes fewer calories for it to process the food, and so you're able to have a net gain that's larger than you would if you ate it like a raw potato.
In a sense, we pre-digest it, so we don't
Yes.
need multiple stomachs like some other animals, like a cow does.
Right. And so we started cooking food, and that's what caused our brain to start getting bigger. And so that idea that like cooking and fire are later things, the premise that they're making and the assertion that they're making is that it really had to be really very early in the beginning because we didn't have the energy store to make our brain bigger. We had to eat the food and start developing a way of getting more calories by cooking to get to that
I,
point.
I have absolutely no proof of this in any way, shape, or form, but I feel fire is as old as the stone tool.
Well, yeah.
I
Well, I
would
mean
tie the two together potentially.
but how? I mean, yes, I don't disagree with you. But if you really stop and think about it, how almost every ancient story about fire is stealing it from the gods or taking it or like it was. It
which is
feels. Go ahead.
which is why when I talk about like speculating about the faiths that may have existed or the
Hmm.
spirituality that may have existed for early hominids that show evidence of it, I think it revolves around fire and
I mean,
earth and
if you
this.
really think about it, most fire, and at the beginning of that, a million years ago, most fire probably came from lightning.
Probably that is probably the initial source. You're absolutely right. But
Most
what makes us what makes
so if
us
that's but if
go ahead,
that's the gods create fire and
create
then
fire.
you
Yes.
figure out how to create
How
fire,
to
you've
create
now
fire from there.
stolen
We've
that from the
stolen that
gods.
fire.
It's yeah.
And I forgot where I was going to go with it. That fire, yeah, I lost it. I lost my train of thought with it.
No,
But it
it's
had
just an
something.
interesting idea that we've got these old stories of gods and power and what they had and what they could do and we
A lot of them
are
were moral, or a lot of them were spiritual, or a lot of them were around survival.
yes.
In a lot of the early forms that we've known, or more what we would consider primitive cultures, even though I don't like that phrasing. I don't know of a better phrasing. Hunter-gatherer type cultures is a better way to say it because I don't like calling a culture primitive. I think we just don't
Right.
understand it. That is a very colonial Western idea I don't like, right?
Yeah,
But again,
absolutely.
I fall back into language. It's habit. Um, I am a child of the Gen X generation, so there's a lot of stuff I'm going to say that's going to, piss people off. Um, but when we get into this stuff, we're not different. Physiologically,
Mm-mm.
we are.
Sort of.
Well, there's a distinct difference between the skeletal structure of 100% pure Homo sapien and 100% pure Homo Neanderthal. I fall
Mhm.
somewhere in between. Again, it's not a lot, but there. But we had common ancestor, and we had common development, and we had similar tools and similar early lifestyles as far as we can tell. Maybe we had a common civilization, you know?
I'm voting for Lord of the Rings, man.
Yeah.
Like all these
I'm I'm
different
I'm
races living in different parts of the world. It
you
it
know,
it makes sense.
in a sense, you can think of it this way: we had Neanderthal, and we had Homo sapien, and then we had the half elf. And some of us are the half elf or the remnant of the half elf. You know,
Hmm.
the Lord Elrod and his brother from the Lord of the Rings, right? One picked one way, and one picked one picked
Right.
mortal life, and one picked immortality. Um, but this is going to be an important question for us at some point in the future, and science does things now without asking whether it should, right? We move forward because we can.
Right. But we also need to be careful of where we came from and be aware of what.
Well, and I think we need to ask some of those ethical questions about what do we what do we do when somebody says, "I cloned a Neanderthal. Here they are."
Well, I mean, I don't. Yeah. I mean,
I mean, let's be honest. And I say this, and I want to talk about de-extinction at some point. But I saw an article today that had a video and I need to find out exactly when it came from because I didn't see a date. But they found a mammoth in Siberia coming out of a glacier, not just the permafrost, but like coming out of a glacial area. And when they cut it, it bled, and it's the purest mammoth blood they found. And they said the meat looks fresh, but it smells a little rotten. But we could probably cook it and eat it. And we know for a fact that they dug up mammoths. This is in historical record in Alaska and ate the meat in the
2013.
in the gold rush. When was it?
2013, they found the
2013.
fresh flesh and blood samples.
And there have been people attempting, and this video claimed that people have been attempting to clone the mammoth since the 90s. And there was a big Discovery Channel special that came out during the pandemic, um, that talked about how it's just a matter of time now. It's going to
There's a
happen.
project actually going
There's a couple.
on. Forrest Gallant talked about it on Rogan. I don't know, 2-3 months ago, about how they're trying to bring back the mammoth in Siberia because it helps pack the permafrost and
Yes, and
it'll
they've
help
kind
with
of built a
global climate
park.
change. Yeah.
Yeah, they've built a park area for it, and
Feel like he said Pleistocene Park, but that
something
feels
like that. Yeah.
wrong, but I think it might be right.
Um, but it's just, how different are we? How different are we? And other reason that question is important is, are we really that different than our neighbors now? You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, and that's a
We're
question we need to ask. We're
we're
so
we're
divided right
arguing
now. We're fighting
over
over things, all kinds of things.
yeah.
Some of them for very legitimate reasons. Some of them are not. But God, we got to figure out a way to talk to each other without killing each other. You
Absolutely.
know?
We're at least we're all the same species, you know? Like why do we treat each other like we're not?
Are we? I'm a hybrid.
Well,
And I mean, I keep
we're
coming
all a
back to that. And again,
hybrid.
it's not a lot, but we're finding out that we're not. That's the thing. Like, not all of the people on the planet have the same genetic background. We discovered
Right.
another extinct species of hominid through studying DNA of people in Asia that we have no bones for.
Yeah, they just
So
figured it
there's
out. They
there's a
found a
bigger
ghost.
story here. There's a deeper
Always.
story, a richer story, and we need to come together and ask these kind of questions. And if we do, it will help us talk to our neighbors and find common ground with them. You
Absolutely.
know, maybe we put the phones down and we break bread together again. So
Sounds like a good idea. Yeah.
that's what I got.
All right.
You know.
Excellent. Well, we'll wrap it there. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll see you next time.